Okay, great. So I'll make a start. I see that we've still got a couple more people joining, but we've obviously got limited time. We're going to try and keep it to an hour as we did last week. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining. This is the second in a series of webinars that we're co-hosting with the Knowledge Transfer Network's AI for Services group. The project that I'm currently leading with colleagues from a number of universities and partners across the UK, looking at innovating next generation services firms. So the structure and the focus of these webinars is really looking at the transition and development of technology and professional services firm as a result of the pandemic and beyond, and particularly focusing today on the nature of embedding and developing change. So very briefly, before I hand on to Isabel Parker as the chair for today, I just wanted to say a little bit about the project and invite people to get involved and participate. The project is currently split over 3 phases and is ongoing for another year. The first part of the project and the work we've been doing has been undertaking a series of deep dives, looking at firms and the challenges associated with adopting advanced tech and AI. And you'll hear some more about that from one of our speakers today, James Faulconbridge. The second part of the project is looking at futures and trying to use design thinking and scenario planning to try and challenge firms in thinking about the futures within which they will operate and what that means in terms of data, what that means in the use of some of these technologies. And again, another one of our speakers today, Bob Booth, will talk some more about that and the way in which the pandemic has accelerated change within some of the organizations that we're thinking about associated with next generation services. The third part of the project is really design sprint. So this is actually going into firms and trying to work with firms to help identify the challenges that advanced technology and AI can help address, and design and think about a roadmap and pathway to helping achieve that change. So the open invitation that it's quite nice to be able to offer to participants on the call and more broadly is that if you do think that that may be something that's of interest and beneficial to your firm or your organization, please do reach out to us and ask us. We've got the resource, we've got the capability to do more of these design sprints. We had a full suite of programs planned over the summer, which are now not going ahead. But as we take some of those online, the opportunity to engage is still very much there. So kind of moving on from that, before I kind of, like I say, hand over and we get into the speakers for today, we've got the third of the webinar series next week, where we've got, again, contributions from Derek Southall, Isabel Parker, Martin Spring, Becky Shields from Moore Kingston Smith, and Sophia Adams-Batty from Wavelength, and Lucy Kimball will be chairing that. So again, another kind of great lineup next week. And if you did miss last week's webinar, then you can actually catch that online. We'll share details and the link to that when we send out a reminder to register for next week's webinar as well. And you can see the link there, obviously, at the bottom. Unfortunately, you do have to register webinar by webinar. We've got a good number of repeat attendees, but also welcome to those that haven't participated previously. So in terms of the speakers today, it's great to be able to kind of host a kind of a varied group of academics and practitioners representing a kind of a range of different areas. So James Faulconbridge from Lancaster University, the management school. James is a co-I on the project. Carlo Cordasco from the University of Sheffield. So again, working on the project team, going to talk a little bit about kind of social norms. We've got Marcus Scott, the Chief Operating Officer from the City UK. Kirstin Gillon, who's the Technical Manager at ICAEW, and Bob Booth from IBM. So in kind of facilitating the proceedings and the discussion from this point on, I'm also delighted to hand over to Isabel Parker. And Isabel is the outgoing Chief Innovation Officer of Freshfields, and I'm going to hand over and put everything in your safe hands, if that's okay as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. So yes, I'm Isabel Parker. I'm going to chair our session today. It's the second of our series, all about embedding change in professional services. And obviously this is incredibly topical as the industry reacts to what looks like it's going to be the most significant inflection point of all our professional careers. So we've got 5 really impressive speakers lined up today, and they're representing a very diverse range of perspectives, from the legal research, academic perspective, right through to deep technology expertise, through to industry insight. So this is going to be a really engaging session, and I hope you get a lot out of it. In terms of logistics, each of the presenters is going to present for about 8 minutes, and we're going to be relatively strict with that so that we can keep things ticking along. I suggest we go right through without questions, get through the 40 minutes, and then open up for a 20 minutes of questions at the end. I mean, keep submitting your questions anyway as we go through in the chat function. I'll keep an eye on it. I'll pull questions out, and then once everyone's presented, we can put those to the panel at the end. If you have technical problems, you can't hear us or see us, let us know through the chat as well, and hopefully we can resolve those. Good. Well, I'm excited. I think this is going to be a fantastic session. I'm going to kick off by asking Professor James Faulconbridge from Lancaster University just to come and introduce yourself quickly, James, and tell us what you want to talk about, what your focus of interest is.
Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you, Isabel. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm going to share some slides with you to support what I'm going to do. So I'll just get that up and running. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, I'm James Faulconbridge from Lancaster University, and as Tim has already mentioned, I'm part of the Next Generation Professional Service Firms project, and for the last 20 years or so I've been researching professional service firms and broadly different issues associated with management, from what used to be called knowledge management, a term we don't hear very much anymore perhaps, through to globalization, and most recently work on new technologies and artificial intelligence in particular. So what I want to do in kind of my 8 minutes is to provide a summary of some of the things we've learned in the last year as part of the Next Generation Professional Service Firm project, but to reflect on perhaps what it might tell us about how we might think about change and embedding change in professional service firms as we go through the current kind of disruption associated with COVID. So it's kind of extrapolating the lessons and thinking what they mean for how we think about innovation, but how we think about change as well. So to begin with, and on the right hand side of the slide I'm displaying at the moment, we can debate for a long time what we mean by innovation, but when we talk about technology and artificial intelligence particularly, often the first thing people arrive at is the idea of kind of expediting, doing things quicker and probably cheaper. And obviously there's an important part of the story that connects to that agenda. But what our research has shown is that if we think of innovation in those terms, that we're really only thinking about part of the picture. So as we look at the kind of changes that COVID-19 and the disruption is kind of imposing on firms, yes, we need to think about these kind of efficiency and productivity agendas, but recognize that they also need to be connected to questions about change in the kind of services that firms offer and the way technology can facilitate that. It also needs to be connected to questions about quality and how the quality of services, the rigor of the analysis that supports the decision making and advice that clients get, how that can also be enabled by technology. So there's a much bigger picture that we need to think about, and I want to kind of try and illustrate that a little bit as best I can in the time we have, and think about again what that means for the current moments. So just to take one example, we've been looking at accounting and law firms, and just to take an example from the legal sector. Of what we're calling the augmented professional, and this is I don't think we claim copyright to this term. Many people talk in this way about augmenting professional practice using technology. I won't read the quote from one of our interviewees, but the spirit of that quote is to capture the idea that's represented by the T on the right hand side of this slide, whereby when we think about using technology, we can think about how technology can advance existing forms of professional practice. So how it can change the way that we currently do things by substituting one process that may have been done manually for the use of technology and allowing us to do it perhaps quicker, maybe better than before. And that's really an important part of the story of embedding technology into the current ways of doing things. But the top of the T on the right hand side, so this is a T-shaped lawyer as the interviewee described it, is thinking about how technology also can help us to deliver new things for clients, new types of services, new business models for the organization. And so as we reflect on the impacts of COVID and what it means for professional service firms, we need to be thinking in both ways. How can technology help us do what we already do better? But how might it also allow us to do new things and rethink what we mean by an accounting firm, a law firm, or any other kind of professional service firm? So what we've developed as part of the project is what we call a book of cases. And my email address is on the screen there, and these are still in draft form, but if you have an interest in them, and get in touch and tell me a little bit about what you're doing, and we'll be able to share these with people. So get in touch if you want to know more. I won't go through all of these now, I haven't got time. But what the Book of Cases shows is that from the firms we've looked at, technology is being used to change their operations in a whole variety of ways. And there is no single story. It certainly isn't only a story of efficiency and speed and price. That's part of the story, but many other things are going on, from changing of business models to, for example, become software vendors, or to have a data analytics stream, to what can be provided to clients, through to innovations in the kind of ways of working in terms of collaborations, incubators, innovation teams, etc. There's a whole array of different changes that need to be thought about, and in the COVID moment, these changes are more relevant than ever. And so as firms are thinking about what does this mean for our future, really want to encourage that kind of wider thinking about what technology might do. What we've also got coming out of the project is what we call a book of approaches. So this is the second part of my kind of plea, I suppose, or my pitch today, is that thinking about what technology can do and making decisions about what it might mean for the future of the firm is really only one part of the story. It's not just a case of plugging in a piece of technology and away you go. Actually, the implementation of that technology, thinking about what it means for the way the organization operates, and crucially in professional service firms, of course, what it means for people, for the professionals themselves. That's an absolutely essential part of implementation, which is as challenging as thinking about, well, what can the technology do for us? So there are decisions that have to be made about how to move forward in terms of implementation, because there are many different routes to implementing these new technologies, but the crucial thing is that there's a really well thought through plan. So in the Book of Approaches, what we do is document a whole series of different approaches to embedding technology within professional service firms. And this diagram summarizes some of the themes that come up in that book, ranging from things around competency to use technology, through to questions about people's career paths, about how you manage expectations, through to issues around, do you impose new technology on people, or do you adopt a more organic diffusion strategy? So again, I can't go through all these now, but the point is that when thinking about this moment of disruption, we really need to reflect on a long-term strategy to embed technology, and not just questions of what kind of solution will it provide once it's implemented. So to kind of wrap up, in the current moment, the reflections, some firms that were early movers in this space have already seen advantages of having access to new technologies. For example, providing new kinds of service offering during the COVID moment, where new kinds of client demand emerged that technology could quickly help them respond to. And they've also been able to use the lessons they've learned from trying to implement technology before the COVID moment to help with the transition, working at home being one of those dimensions, but only one of them. For those that perhaps hadn't moved quite so early, though, there are still opportunities out there for everybody. There are clearly new insights emerging into why technology might be important, and the opening of doors that were closed perhaps before in many contexts. And in that idea about implementing and the kind of implementation strategy, the perspectives that are starting to emerge, the kind of norms that Carlo is going to talk about in a moment that perhaps were preventing change previously, some of those have started to shift. They may shift back the other way quickly, as if we get to a new normal, as everybody likes to talk about. But there is an opportunity to think about how to begin the process of embedding technology now, thanks to some of the changes that have taken place as a result of the impacts of COVID. So that gives a kind of brief summary of what we've been doing, and kind of the key lessons of think about what technology can do in a broad way, but also think about how you're going to implement it. So I'm going to stop there, and I think Carlo, who will be next, will develop some of that a little bit more and tell you a bit more about some of the kind of finer grain detail of what we've learned from our study.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, James. Really interesting to hear about the people challenges of embedding technology change. I know from my own experience that this is often overlooked and extremely important to take into consideration. And as we hand over to Carlo, who, as James said, has been looking at norms and expectations in professional services firms and how they inhibit or encourage change, I wonder, Carlo, if you have any, not deflecting from your presentation, but if you have any observations on what James was saying about the augmented professional, that T-shaped professional. In your experience and in your research, is there anything that has shown what might push against developing those kind of hybrid skills, or what might encourage it?
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. Actually, I mean, James has provided a fantastic overview of what we've been doing in the past year, really trying to understand what the drivers and barriers to AI in professional services are. And, you know, we've been, in our interviews and in our discussions with professionals, we actually learned that, you know, there is a sort of like mixed motives in thinking about adoption of artificial intelligence in the profession. Of course, we have enthusiasts, but we also have people who are actually reluctant for various reasons. And that's actually what I'm going to be talking today a little bit. I'm trying to unpack a little bit more on what is commonly referred as the cultural challenge to embedding AI within professional services firms. So actually, I'm going to sort of share the screen to illustrate this. Hopefully everyone can see this. Okay, so basically the main goal of my work within the past year was to precisely to understand what the barriers to AI adoption are in professional services firms, right? We wanted to understand whether, you know, the potential for augmented professional judgment and advice faces some challenges in finding its way in within the professional context and in legal and accounting firms. But of course, you know, cultural challenges are not the only challenge that we've observed when talking to professionals. We know that, for instance, there is a lot of skepticism about the maturity of existing technology that could potentially help and augment professional judgment, right? So we've been talking to a lot of lawyers and accountants, and often we've learned about their struggle with trying to adopt those tools because sometimes those are still inadequate, right, to perform the tasks they've been designed for. And of course, there are, you know, concerns about budget constraints because bringing in AI tools is expensive, and the technology is still progressing fastly, right? So you may not want to be in a position in which you've invested a lot of money, and then the product you've brought in, it's not the one that is going to be setting the standard for the future, right? But my interest as someone that has mostly expertise on informal institutions, both at the societal level and within the firm, was to understand what the cultural challenges were, right? So when we talk to professionals and institutional bodies, we often hear about professionals' reluctance to engage in experimentation with AI. But of course, that's a buzzword, right? So what do we mean by cultural challenges? And that's what we try to do, was to unpack what the cultural challenge is, right? And so we made sense, we rationalized this reluctance by referring to two main mechanisms or pressures that are the cultural, cognitive, and the normative pressures, which we borrowed from Richard Scott's account of institutions within the profession. So let me unpack a little bit about those. So the idea for the cultural cognitive pressure is that professionals, the legal professionals or accountants, build their skills and heuristics around practices and routines, which are shaped by a technological paradigm, which means that professionals already live in a certain technological paradigm, which gives rise to practices and routines, and they learn how to move within this particular technological landscape. They build those skills around those. And when they think about technological advancements such as AI, what happens is that they come to think that this is going to require an incredibly costly reskilling process, along with the internalization of new practices and routines. And what we know is that especially in the mid-tier sector, this shapes some sort of negative attitudes towards adoption of AI. So we have observed this quite evidently. Normative pressures, on the other hand, are even more explicit than cultural cognitive pressures. So what we know is that professionals are often, and I believe rightly characterized as individuals that actually strongly and positively identify with their occupation. So they like their job, they are super motivated by non-monetary incentives associated with their work. So for instance, they like to perform high knowledge intensive tasks and to be recognized for their contribution to societal well-being because of performing those tasks, right? And there is this background thought according to which AI, in some sense, could potentially strip away some of those tasks from the end of the professional, or could dramatically change the nature of their work to which they attach normative value, right? But of course, what we also learned from our interviews and was that not everyone actually shares those cultural, cognitive, and normative concerns, right? Yet, there is a narrative around the fact that AI advancement within professional services is still very slow. So how we tried and rationalize this particular problem by reference to social norms as a transmission mechanism. So here's a GIF of Homer Simpson just littering. And I mean, if you live in a civilized community, what happens is that, you might have a preference for littering. You might want to get rid of that cup, really. But if you look around you, you observe that people do not actually litter in that particular circumstance, right? And if you've lived in that community for a while, you may also come to think that other people don't want you to litter in that particular circumstance. So that's essentially what a social norm really is, right? It's constituted by two sorts of expectations, empirical and normative expectations. So empirical expectations are the sort of expectations that you form by observing what's happening around you. And normative expectations are sort of like belief about other people's beliefs. So you believe that other people believe that you should or shouldn't do X in circumstances Y. So whether or not you have a preference for doing a certain action in certain circumstances, if you observe people around you not doing that, and if you think those people don't want you to do that, you will coordinate with them. Now, this is something we have observed within the firms with respect to AI adoption, right? This is a very simple example. So there is a firm that invests in a certain AI tool, it brings it in, and anyone in this firm can actually use that particular tool. However, we observe that the actual use of T of that tool is significantly dependent on team leaders' attitudes. So if a professional P believes that the team leader L has negative attitudes towards that particular tool, then the professional is much less likely to learn about T and to use it. So what we have observed is that team leaders' attitudes give rise to people normative expectations, which shape their behavior, right? So if I believe that my team leader doesn't really like the product, then I believe that I shouldn't really use it. And so even though I might have a preference for experimenting with the tool, even though I might actually like to use the tool because I don't share, say, the cultural, cognitive, or the normative concern, I still coordinate and not use it. Now, of course, we know that professional services firms have to prioritize the delivery, right? And that's right. But we also know that experimentation, especially with technology and technological, so we must make sure that in some regards, experimentation is fostered within the firm. And we know that social norms in some respects might hinder experimentation with new technology. So that is just an example, but we've also had examples where it's just a peer effect, not even a trendsetter effect. So you don't really look at the team leader, you look at your colleagues, and then you observe them not really using the AI tool, and basically, nobody ends up using it, right? So this social norms, this both empirical and normative expectation can dramatically affect AI adoption within the firm. So what we suggest by looking at this sort of findings coming out of the project is that changing norms is a really important aspect of embedding technology within the firm. But this also requires a very proactive approach. You need to identify the norms and you need to act to change empirical and normative expectations. How would you do it? So one interesting thing that we came to understand could potentially help a lot is to use design thinking to unpack empirical and normative expectations. So to gather professionals around the table and to understand exactly what their attitudes are, what their belief about other people's beliefs are, and try to unpack exactly what sorts of attitudes emerge out of this discussion. How do we change expectations? Well, we've observed a lot of interesting solutions. Creating new tech roles for professionals, which changes empirical expectations, but also to define attractive career paths, which shapes new normative expectations. You come to understand that using and experimenting technology has a positive value because it could potentially foster and help with the career. But also pick team leaders with this propensity and attitudes to experimentation. And one thing that I think finally is underappreciated is to free professionals from anti-innovation norms. which basically means to state clearly that team leaders' attitudes should not affect one's preference or willingness to experiment with or adopt AI tools in their practices and routines. And that is basically my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlo. That's really, really fascinating stuff. It's so interesting, particularly in the environment we find ourselves today, where we're all watching each other, talking about herd immunity, to hear how social norms can really influence the way we adopt technology. Very, very interesting stuff. And Marcus, you know, I was wondering whether you recognize this kind of tendency towards fast following or just following the herd amongst those that you speak to and represent. And if you do recognize it, do you think it's enough to sort of drive true innovation? Marcus?
Yeah, the classic mistake. I do apologize. I said I must say that about twice a day, and there we go. It's once today already. Yes, I do definitely recognize that. And some of the comments that I'm going to make, I think, are more about how do you create a framework in which you ensure that you maintain some proper boundaries whilst getting the most out of it. So I'll just very quickly, for people who don't know, City UK is a membership body, and we look after financial and related professional services, and it's about 2.3 million people across the UK, so it's about 1 in every 12 jobs in the UK, so it's an enormous industry, and the professional services piece of that is about half of that industry. And of course, digitalizing professional services doesn't mean necessarily using AI, but clearly when you've got increasingly vast amounts of data being gathered through digital means, there has to be a way of sorting that data to make it usable. And that's where the application of AI, or rather probably more properly machine learning as it is now, comes in. And this didn't obviously start with COVID, but as I read recently, pandemics tend to accelerate trends that are already in train. So I think this is just going to accelerate that trend more and more. And I'm going to make a few comments about the longer term and hopefully stimulate some debate around that. We released a report last year with Accenture called Towards an AI-Powered UK. And I think those comments are still relevant today, in that we estimated that AI could generate about 650 billion of gross value added to the UK economy through a combination of intelligent automation, augmentation of labour and capital investments. And that could increase the annual growth rate of GVA from something like 2.5% to almost 4%. And as a result of that, you get this diffusion of innovation across the economy, which could increase productivity by 25%. And that's something the UK desperately needs, as it lags behind other Western economies in terms of productivity. And I think the key point to emphasize here is there is an opportunity for AI to create new jobs and opportunities in the UK, not necessarily just replace them. So AI, or more accurately machine learning as it currently is, has the ability to automate much of the mundane and expensive work that it's very difficult to persuade clients to pay for. For example, ideally, it could bring down the cost of accessing the law, which in turn brings greater access to law for a greater number of people, which is a fundamental principle of democracy and building fairness in society. Except I don't think that's necessarily the way it's headed at the moment. Despite all the opportunities that AI can offer the industry, I think there are a number of challenges that we need to overcome, and we identified 5 of those, and I'm just going to quickly list those. The first is a lack of clear definition of what constitutes AI and therefore how it should be regulated. The second is an expectation gap that exists both from customers and from the industry practitioners between what's expected of AI and what AI can actually deliver in practice. I think thirdly, we've got an understanding of how to scale AI systems across business, and when they're often initially developed on a very limited closed platform basis. Fourthly, I think there's a huge shortage of tech talent that's needed to develop and implement AI technologies at scale across the industry, and that's definitely inhibiting growth. And then fifthly, there is a public perception challenge, which stems from a public debate which is heavily influenced by discussions about the impact that AI will have on employment and privacy. Now, I think those discussions are important, but I think they need to be had in a slightly different way. And I'm going to focus on policy and regulation framework in my opening comments. Most parts of professional services, professional business services, are highly regulated. And that's rightly so, because we look after other people's assets, money, and information. You might share your status on Facebook, but you probably wouldn't share the same information that you'd share with a lawyer or an accountant, or even in the case of other professionals, information that you would share with a doctor. And that's where the first challenge comes. In AI or machine learning, there is little regulation. And the problem is that regulation takes time and technology moves fast. And the rules are now far behind the reality. And that matters because AI could be the next conduct scandal if we're not careful. I'll give you an example. Let's say you upload confidential client information to a platform. That ends up on a server in San Jose, which ends up as part of a training set, which gets sold on to advertisers and other partners and then gets used to predict outcomes and behaviors. Well, have you breached client confidentiality? Nobody really knows. There's no clear guidance on it. And also, the people designing those systems and the training sets aren't infallible. I'm sure you read about last year, there was a Google recruitment training set that was developed, a machine learning tool to help them recruit because they get thousands of applications to Google every day. And that training set was built by the very people who are building AI tools in Google themselves. And because of the training set they used, they built in gender and race bias into their recruiting processes, completely unintentionally, but it just shows you that the people who know most about this are not necessarily infallible. And I don't know whether you've read Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff's book about the age of surveillance capitalism, which was published in 2019. But in an interview with The Guardian, she made some really important points about how this new knowledge territory has become the subject of political conflict. And she has a very good way of describing this. She says the first conflict is over the distribution of knowledge, who knows? The second is about authority, who decides who knows? And the third is about power, who decides who knows? So we're at a key point as to how the rules are set for this. Some would have you believe that regulation can never keep up. But I think that kind of nihilism is largely self-serving to avoid regulation appearing in areas where they see significant profits. We know that market failure tends to lead to very constrictive regulation, so if we're going to avoid this, we need to be proactive. And I just want to leave you with 4 principles for regulation that can help and that take forward the areas that we highlighted in the report. These all come from a chap called Dr. Mark Warner, who's the CEO of Faculty.ai. First is that regulation should be context specific. So AI is not one technology. The consequences of a diagnostic error in medicine are far greater than an algorithm pushing an irrelevant advert into your social media feed. Secondly, regulation should be precise and should not be left up to tech companies themselves to interpret. Allow for analysis across accuracy, fairness, privacy, robustness, and explainability with precise thresholds. Thirdly, regulation must balance transparency with trust, so according to the importance of each and the subject of differing licensing regimes. And then fourth and finally, that regulators will need to equip themselves with the skills and know-how designed to manage and design the regime, and they must be able to look under the bonnet and investigate. And I think that's vital. So in summary, I think if we want to get the most out of AI, we need the technology to serve people and not the other way around.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Marcus. Very interesting to touch on the policy and regulation framework. I think it's a very important part of this jigsaw puzzle. And just reflecting on where we've got to from the three speakers so far, and turning now to Kirstin. If you were going to attack one of these challenges that we've highlighted first, regulation, talent, or behaviours, which would you prioritise, looking at it from your own perspective and your members' perspective?
Well, I think there are all significant challenges in the accountancy profession too. I think we've focused a lot in recent years on skills and the talent side of it and trying to think about the skills within the accountancy profession that we need to increasingly be developing to help our members make use of these technologies, particularly around data and statistics and really looking at what kinds of skills we need. But I think equally there are big cultural challenges and behavioural change that needs to come. And I think it's going to be interesting as a result of this, the pandemic and the crisis and coming out of that, whether this is an opportunity to really see some significant culture change. I think the signs are there's a great desire for that. I think the proof's in the pudding in terms of how that's delivered, but I think there is a desire to use this opportunity to push some of that culture change and behavioural change through much more quickly. So just in terms of my own background and just a few minutes or a few seconds about ICAEW and my role there, I work in the tech faculty and we are the sort of the focal point for the Institute's activities around technology, and that divides into 2 bits. Part of it is around providing practical help and support and tips and guidance to members for making good use of technology. And then part of it is around more research and thought leadership on what technology means for the future of the profession, thinking about things like skills, looking about some of those aspects of change. We work quite closely with the NGS program and support the innovation and try and bring in that perspective of our members to help the research projects and the innovation be successful. So that's very much our priority. And just in the few minutes I've got here, I just wanted to share a bit of the experience of our members over the last few weeks and few months, and think about what that might point to in the future as we come out of this, and what the opportunities are for change, perhaps more quickly than had been anticipated. Because I think if we go back to the beginning, before the crisis, I think it's fair to say the profession has been looking at digital technology and investment and innovation for quite a few years now, been led by the big four, undoubtedly, who've got the resources and the money and the skills to do that. But that has been spreading across the profession in the last year or two. The mid-market has been looking much more at technology and what they can do. So lots of interest, and I think a good baseline around what they're doing, but at the same time progress is still patchy and has been slow because of a lot of the issues raised around business case, investment, culture change. There's regulatory aspects around some of it, having the right skills. So there's a whole host of reasons why change has perhaps been slower than we would like to see. And I think if we look at the impact of the last couple of months, we've very much seen that idea of 2 years worth of transformation in 2 months. I think that has been absolutely seen across the profession, partly the working at home and just the willingness of people to make things work in a way that maybe they've been a bit more reluctant to do in the past. But when you are at home and you have to make things work, then people just make things work and have been using tools and adopting things in a way that maybe wasn't being done before. And I think certainly the home working, the technology side of it, the word we've often heard from a lot of our members is that it's been actually pretty seamless. But the infrastructure was often there, and a lot of accountants have worked on client sites at home. They are quite a mobile profession anyway, and the technology has been seamless. The issues have been around isolation, around childcare, that kind of stuff, and particularly younger people, and some of the issues around training and mentoring and that side of things. Those are more of the issues we're seeing rather than the technology side. So I think that's all worked really well. And then we've seen a range of other digital transformation that's just happened really quickly. So e-signatures, again, has been a classic example of something that's been sitting in legal departments' inboxes for 6 months or a year. It's been on the list of things to do, never happened. Within a week, the contract signed, the tool's being done, because you just had to do it. So there's been that kind of digital sort of transformation very quickly, as well as a whole range of other solutions to support audit, remote auditing, remote virtual stock taking, exchanging data via portals, a whole range of technologies to support those kinds of activities to help firms just, fairly successfully continue what they've been doing. I think 2 key observations from that in terms of lessons to think about going forward. One has been the recognition of how incredibly valuable this all is for productivity. I think there was a great fear that everyone working at home would be massively unproductive, and yet actually it's been hugely productive, and people have been able to work much more flexibly, able to switch between clients. There's been a real sense of everyone's got huge productivity gains from working in this way. So I think that's something people want to hold on to. And then also the importance of data. I think, again, the importance of transparency, of really understanding what you're trying to measure, and the value of data and making good management decisions has come home. And the people who've done, the firms we speak to that have done best and feel most confident around this have been ones that have got good data and really understand exactly what's happening in their organization and with their clients as well. So if we look forward, and I guess the big question is how much of this is going to stick and how much of this is going to slip back as people go back into the office, how much are we going to see people slipping back into the old ways of doing things. I think there's certainly a very big desire to really use this as an opportunity for actually quite big culture change. I think there's a real desire to see professionals, the accountancy firms move away from being in the office all the time and really seize the benefits of more flexible working in terms of work-life balance and just, getting away from the hierarchy, because everyone's seeing everyone in their office, in their home kitchen, and the kids are walking in. It kind of takes away a lot of the hierarchy. It really has quite a profound culture change, and there's a real sense of wanting to drive that forward, because if we don't do it now, we're never going to do it. So I think there is that sense that this is a time to really try and drive some of that culture change forward. But also that productivity question. I think as we move into recovery, the focus is going to shift from where we have been, which is about cash and survival, to actually it's all about productivity and making profit again. And so I think efficiency and productivity is going to be absolutely crucial to firms and to their clients. So I think we're going to see a big focus on automation and all the ways in which productivity can be improved. But just to finish with, I think there's a third interesting point, which is that we are starting to see some of those questions around what is the value of what we do? What is the purpose of the firm? Why are we doing things like this? And some of those deeper questions that James mentioned at the beginning, which is where you start to get closer to real transformation, not just doing what we do in a digital rather than paper-based way, but actually what is the purpose of the profession? And linking into some of those comments about AI, I think that is something, a discussion we would certainly welcome, to think much more deeply around the role of the profession with AI and what is the skills and the real value the profession brings. What can we do radically differently? What are the opportunities for new services in this world? And maybe this will also prompt some of those wider debates and more profound debates around what we're actually doing and why we're doing it and what the value is and how we can do things differently. So we're starting to see some of those questions now, and that'll be interesting to see if that continues as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kirstin. It's good to hear such a positive summation of what's been happening over the last 3 months, because I think there is a lot of positives to take away from this. We beat ourselves up as professional services quite a lot, but there have been great strides made. To your last point, though, and moving on to Bob, you referred to 2 years of transformation in 2 months. I think that's true, and sort of a seamless shift to remote working. But does this mean the sort of digital job, Bob, now is done in professional services and we can all sort of sit back and relax and applaud ourselves, or is there more to be done?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. So my name's Bob Booth. I work for IBM. I am a chartered accountant by profession. You might not struggling with the 10. I am a chartered accountant by profession. But I want to talk about sort of 3 things. I want to talk about what our customers have been experiencing, so your customers, and what's happened during the course of COVID-19. I want to talk about a little bit about what we think what's happening in the professional services, particularly one of our clients, Ernst & Young, and then actually talk a little bit about what it might mean for us. But I mean, some of the things that we've talked about previously, in particular, the piece around ethics. So we've got out of the facial recognition business in the last 2 days. Our CEO has written to Congress about facial recognition and the impact on racial bias, which we're really proud of. So I think there are lots of topics in here around ethics, around how we audit around AI and all those good things that will be really interesting over the course of the next sort of 24 months. But kind of now, I guess, so where were we? Where were our clients, in the days of COVID, sort of in March? I think it was really about stabilize, protect the employees, protect the supply chains, operations, understand which customers absolutely had to be the ones you focused upon. And we already see immediate channel expansion for customers and citizens, in plain language. People wanted ways to immediately connect. So we worked with a bank. The government said, of course you can delay payments of your mortgages. We'll give you a furlough on your mortgage. And then, of course, the banks went, well, how are we going to do that, right? So we were able to stand something up in 4 days that allowed them to take basic communication, basic conversation, and everyone moved towards a remote working. So actually, we all did that, and it's interesting. I completely agree with Kirstin's comments around efficiency and effect it had on our productivity. And then, kind of moving forward, what does survive look like? Our customers and your customers are taking out cost. I mean, I think there's a difference between cost transformation and sort of cost reduction, but they're finding ways to eliminate cost in the short term. And they were thinking about, what is my future talent and partnership model? They're also doing rapid AI experimentation. James and Carlo both talked about this. Actually, how can you try something out? Because most of what people were trying to do wasn't about being a bit more efficient. It wasn't about cost reduction. It was mainly about finding new ways to do things. They're also thinking through, what does remote working at scale mean? How can we think about how we can collaborate with our clients across, large scale workshops? We've gone live with lots and lots of large scale systems in the time because we've thought through about how we can do that at scale. So people were finding ways to be able to work at scale. And I guess now we do, as everyone said, we do see people starting to think about what the next phase of sort of almost hyper digitization looks like. Completely agree with what everyone said around timescales. Things that used to take 6 months, were in the long-term roadmap for things that people needed to do. It happened in days, happened in weeks. And what people are thinking about, back to what James said, you know, how to win business with a differentiated capability. How can we not just make what we're doing more efficient and more effective? How can we do different things? How can we reinvent? And having experimented with a piece of AI that says, actually, let's try this out and see how it works. How can we then, you know, develop that to an enterprise scale? How can we get to the point where, for example, everyone's got a tool to be the best lawyer? How can we think about how we can give these tools and make them available across the piece? And I think, again, remote working is normal. So as we go back, I think the physical location around schools and offices will be really different. So we'll be reconfiguring the way we're working. So we're seeing this working through. It affected our business in the same way. I think it's affected, you know, our mutual customers, and I think it's also affecting the profession as well. So just to touch on a couple of examples. I'm not going to play this video, but just to try and hand a bit of time back for questions. But we work with Ernst & Young around their candidate process. And actually, we use this ourselves in North America, where we got, you know, up to 100,000 jobs online at any one time. Ernst & Young wanted a great candidate experience. They wanted to be able to sort of, you know, use AI to be able to converse with and then receive information from their candidates to get the right candidate for the right match, have a great experience, win the best people, and also drive forward their retention and adoption rates. So they're using this in a way, and I will send this content out, we'll make the links available. They're able to do this in a way that, that really differentiates them, reduces their cost to serve, and by using some basic conversational tools in their website, they're actually able to focus their recruits on the most important candidates. They also had another challenge, right? So when they implemented their own HR system internally, they rolled it out and got a lot of questions happening as a result of it. So we helped them stand up a chatbot, a virtual assistant, and you know, it's something we rolled out to 150 countries, 250,000 professionals in 31 days. So I hear the point that people made in the research that Carlo received about there's a perception, and I think it's really interesting thinking about these cultural norms. The sense this stuff is expensive. Actually, you can go quite quick with AI as long as you experiment with it sensibly, and you can make quite good progress in not very much time. So there is an opportunity actually to be able to experiment with something, to be able to make progress, and then as we get through the next sort of 6 months, start thinking, well, how can I make that available consistently for all my practitioners across the whole piece. So there's an example of kind of how professional services worked at scale. So what does it mean? So for me, there's a question mark what will happen in the next 6 or 12 or 24 months for the profession. So we know that the ability to be able to provide services differently, reinvent services, you know, provide people with more skills allows disruption. We know that the accounting firms are getting into the law business. There's talk of, you know, if only Google did law or advisor or Apple did, what would happen? So I think there's going to be some disruption. So being able to continually reinvent your services, as James talked about, in a way that allows you to differentiate is going to be really important, because what actually really matters is your understanding of your clients and their business challenges. I think it also means something for the decision-making process, particularly for partnerships. So I think one of the challenges we have in a partnership model is actually it comes back to something of consensus. Actually, I was reflecting on what Carlo was talking about in terms of some of those cultural norms. And I guess particularly if you have a partnership structure that encourages, you know, the sort of longer term people to have more power, then you might find decision making is a challenge. So I think there's something there about what is a decision? How do I decide? How do I experiment? And then how do I ensure I can scale it? But probably most importantly, and I'm really experiencing this as well, because I run a team of people in the UK. Staff well-being and retention is really a challenge. And Kirstin talks about this a little bit as well in terms of young people. We see sort of, you know, 4 or 5 different personas. So people like myself, actually, before lockdown, I was traveling to my clients 4 days a week. I was trying to do multiple jobs, and actually I was away from my family. I'm now with my family much more. So I'm probably working more, but I'm actually with my family more. For me, it's a good thing. Many of my team might be in London sharing a house with people that they never used to meet before. You know, meet them 5 hours a week and suddenly they're with them all the time and they're working from their bedroom, which is also their office. So I think there's a real question mark about what we can do to ensure our staff well-being. And we're doing a bunch of things, which we can talk about, to make sure people are surviving through this process. And even in the last week, I had the conversation last night with my wife, even in the last week, when the weather's got suddenly much duller, it's actually been much more difficult to motivate ourselves and our children. So I think it's really interesting what this period has meant has been some really rapid decision-making. That rapid decision-making is affecting our clients and it is affecting us as professionals. And I think as we move forward and work out what we want to apply and how we want to apply it, the main thing we need to think about, particularly for people in the profession and indeed people in services business like myself, is how can I make sure I have a team of people that their physical well-being, physical and mental well-being is good, and then how can I make sure I retain the best talent, the open-minded people that are going to think differently about how to proceed.
Thanks, Bob, and that's really, really helpful. And thanks for cutting it slightly short. I haven't said I keep everyone to time. I've failed in that, and we've only really got 10 minutes left for questions. A couple have come in. Firstly, just to point out that Sarah Wheatley, thanks for your comments, Sarah, has been talking about the importance of knowledge transfer, partnerships for driving some of this change. And there's a link, she's put her email address on the chat if anyone wants to follow up on that. A question from John Williams about access to data. If you want to leverage AI or machine learning, you need data sets to do it. That's a challenge. Has anyone got any suggestions on how SMEs can get access to that kind of data? And it goes back to those that joined the first webinar who will have seen Seamus Ray from NGenB talking about common data models for professional services. It sort of touches on that point. So I know other webinars have been interested in that. So panel, very briefly, do you have anything, any helpful suggestions on the data issue?
Let me start off. So the biggest challenge for any kind of transformation, particularly AI, is data. So as you start to think about, and I think James made this point, right? So what is the purpose of what you're doing? As you start to think about transforming any function, you've got to think about what is the data governance process? How do I support it at scale? And then start with a set of data, cleanse that data, and then think about how I fix my data as then you begin to expand.
Thanks. Anybody else on the panel want to pick up? Okay, well, let's move. I hope that answers your question, John. Let's move on to Vanish Patel. This is a question about change management. How do you really affect change when you find it difficult and you don't have sufficient authority, this rings so true, to influence bottom-up culture and change? What are the tools that actually enable that change management to take effect? Anybody want to take that? Maybe that's one for you, Carlo.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I think it's crucial here is to understand what are the reasons that actually shape the reluctance, right? So what I've been saying during the presentation is perhaps we could use, design thinking to understand what are the, what actually shape this negative attitudes toward technology. That's the first bit, right? Once we've understood that, we can try and illustrate how a particular technology works, show its effectiveness, and then try to influence the change bottom up. Then, of course, it would be great if you could also act at the more formal level within the firm. As we said, try and shape career paths for professionals who are tech savvy, because that would shape some positive normative attitudes towards technological change. But in the absence of that, I would strongly suggest to try and understand why professionals exhibit this negative attitudes towards adoption.
Thanks, Carlo. Anybody else want to pick up from the panel?
Maybe I should say a little bit, because this very much connects to our book of approaches, as I talked about, and there isn't a single answer to this, and it is a challenge that everybody faces. But to give one example of the kind of decision making that can be taken, we've seen examples of both top-down imposition and bottom-up kind of diffusion being used. And there are pros and cons of both of them. Top down in theory is quicker, but it can be easily derailed. Bottom up tends to be slower, but often can lead to a more sustained engagement. And a lot depends really on the culture of your firm, on the structure of your firm. but if the organic diffusion one may seem problematic, but actually what I think most of us recognize about professionals is that nobody wants to be the person that's either left behind or not doing what somebody else is doing and succeeding with. So there's a good case, for example, of not worrying about everybody doing it at the start, but working where there are opportunities, because if a partner finds out that another partner is using this technology and has secured a whole series of new clients and is able to go out to clients and as part of the pitch talk about this technology, quite often they're very quickly suddenly interested, whereas if you go out and try and sell it to them as a marketing pitch as to why they should do it, that often doesn't work quite so well. So there are a whole range of different tactics that can be used, but it is, as Carlo was alluding to, thinking about both what you're trying to do, so what is the deliverable, but also how does that fit with the structure of your organization, because depending on everything from your promotion routes, your partner track, and whether actually technology and use of technology is a route to partnership, all these kind of questions are going to feed into it, and which is why, as I said, it talked about in my presentation, it's really important that as much time is spent thinking about the implementation as the technology. I think there's a tendency to really worry about what's the technology, what's it going to do for us, and then forget about, well, how are we actually going to bring it into the organization and make it work.
Thanks, James. And that sort of segues nicely into the final question I think we've just got time for, Tim, which is from Edward Walker. And it's about whether, and I'm going to ask this to Kirstin and Marcus very briefly, if you will, whether in our sort of focus on the economics and our focus on productivity and on AI, we've forgotten the individual professional here and the impact AI tools, negative or positive, might have on that individual. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a really important point that we don't forget the individual. And I think just to reflect back on the comments around the current crisis and these sort of different ways of working, I think what's come across overwhelmingly in the discussion with members is the well-being is what people are prioritizing, and different people have different needs, and there isn't a kind of one size fits all. Said for bringing new people into an organization, that's extremely hard to do in a virtual model. It's very easy for those who've worked for a long time. So I think there is a great, there is a recognition that wellness is really important. But I think equally when you look at productivity and economics, it's quite difficult to make that balance effectively. And I think it's very important and very incumbent on firms to prioritize the staff, because the staff are ultimately the most important asset that the organization has. And I think that absolutely needs to be a top priority continually.
Thanks, Kirstin.
I think the idea of bringing your employees with you and the members of the firm with you along that journey is really important. They should be involved in it and not feel like they're having it imposed on them, because I think also that's where you get the learning and you'll get the input to this. So, this often is quite a specialized area, but I think if you bring in as many people in the wider firm to consult on this and try and determine exactly what it is you're trying to achieve with the AI, it's not an end in itself, but it's a tool to help serve your customers better.
Fabulous. Thanks, Marcus. Tim, can I do a very quick 15-second summing up of the themes I think we've heard?
Yeah.
So there are three things I'd pull out from this, although others may have others. One is challenge, one's optimism, and one's reinvention. On the challenge front, we've all heard today from all speakers that AI adoption isn't easy. There are cultural and people challenges to getting professional services firms to adopt at scale. That's very important to bear in mind. Optimism, there's cause for optimism. Lots of productivity gains, economic gains, and the successes that we should celebrate in having reacted to this crisis as we have done and pivoted our models very, very slickly. And the third point, looking forward, is reinvention. What can we do now that's radically different? What's the next phase of this hyper-digitization, as Bob put it? What does it look like? How do we achieve it? So those are the three things I'd pull out. Thank you very much, panel, and everyone else for your questions. Tim, I'll hand back to you to wrap up.
Lovely, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing that perfectly to time as well, Isabel. I think that the three areas that you identified there certainly kind of really resonate with a lot of the work that's going on in the project. And Marcus's last point there about understanding the problem that the technology is addressing is absolutely critical to the design sprint approach, which the project's looking to deliver. So if anyone on the webinar is interested in kind of finding out more about what we're doing on that front, then please do reach out, look on the website. Zoe, the project manager for us, has posted in the chat the link for next week's webinar. So if you do fancy joining us again, then please do that. We'll be circulating details. But just to end, I'd like to thank Isabel for chairing. I'd like to thank the panelists, and also thank the KTN AI for Services group for helping support and share the details of our webinar. So if you do want to find out more about them, again, the link is in the chat, ktn-uk.co.uk. And AI for Services. So please do Google, find them as well. Well worth kind of registering and becoming a member of that community. So hopefully we'll see many of you again next week. Please do reach out to us and the project team. The website is www.nextgenpsf.co.uk, and you'll find lots of information about what we're doing there. And hopefully we will bring you another interesting and engaging webinar again next week. So